It is 1 p.m. on Friday, February 25th, and I would like to call the meeting of the Ad Hoc Budget Committee to order. Ms. Proteau, could you please call the roll?
Yes, good morning. Okay, Nystrom?
Here.
Rogers?
I'm here.
Roll is complete.
Thank you so much. Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Ad Hoc Budget Committee meeting. My name is Dr. Shakanda Rogers, and I'm the chair of this committee. And I'm joined by fellow board member, Ms. Julie Nystrom. Today, we will be exploring the current financial condition of the board, learning about the fee study that has been conducted, and exploring options for how we might best course correct as we move forward. I anticipate a hearty discussion and am hopeful that we will all leave this meeting with a well-developed understanding of the action needed to ensure the board's continued solvency. Thank you all so much for your time, your attention, and your presence today. And we will move to the next item on the agenda, which is the budget overview provided by the budget staff of the Department of Consumer Affairs. I will turn it over to you.
Thank you very much. My name is Matt Nishamini, and I'm in the DCA Budget Office. I'm here with the Budget Manager, Karen Munoz. The two of us are going to go through a slide presentation that we have. Can we have that come up? Perfect. So next slide, please. So today we're going to be talking about the board's budget. Next slide, please. So the first question is, what do boards do? So boards have a responsibility and a function. So they actually have statutory and regulatory responsibilities. They have to enforce current law, and that's primarily Business and Professions Code, BPC, and other current laws. And they also monitor and must enforce and implement new legislation, as well as the California Code of Regulations. So they have regulatory and statutory authority. And then boards also have programmatic accountability. And so the functions that boards perform would be licensing. You license your professionals, and you also may monitor and examine education requirements. And then there's that enforcement component. Again, the boards are going to enforce current law and current regulations. And then they have an administrative component too, to make sure that the lights stay on and staff is well suited to perform their functions. Next slide, please. So step one in looking at the fiscal side of a board is to look at the fund condition statement. Next slide, please. So this is the Psychology Board's fund condition statement. The fund is 0310. And this is a point in time document. And this point in time, actually, so this one was prepared on January 31st of this year. And it's based upon the 2022-23 governor's budget with FM fiscal month 6 projections. So essentially, we've monitored the revenues and the expenditures through the first 6 months of the year through December. And we've updated that CY column, which is the 21-22 fiscal year. Looking more at this fund condition statement, we do read this from top to bottom and from left to right. So on the left side, we start with a beginning balance. And then we have, going down, we have revenues. So those are the various revenue streams that the board will collect. And then there's some expenditures. And it ends with a fund balance, an ending balance. And that ending balance rolls up to the top of the next fiscal year. Next slide, please. So first thing we want to do is, again, we want to look at the revenues. So these are the projected FM6 revenues for the 21-22 current year. Next slide, please. So if we look at this fund conditions statement, we see that in the 21-22 fiscal year, revenues are projected at $4.6 million. And if we look a little deeper, we can see that delinquent fees comprise about 1% of that 4.6 million. We see other fees, and those are fines, continuing education fees, and duplicate certificates, things like that. And that comprises 4% of the revenues. There are license fees. So these would be initial license fees, application fees, and examination fees. That comprises about 12%. Renewal license fees, biennial renewal license fees. This comprises 80%. 80% of the board's revenues come from renewal license fees. Income from surplus investments, that's 3%. And then we're also going to talk about general fund loans for a second. General fund loans are neither revenues or expenditures, they're loans. And the board loaned the general fund in the 2021 fiscal year $900,000. And this was related to the COVID pandemic emergency. And we would just note that currently the $900,000 is scheduled to be returned in the 22-23 budget year, next year. And that will be repaid with interest. The interest is calculated from the pooled money investment account off of the state controller's office. So the board will be made whole of the $900,000. And then lastly, I just want to talk about reimbursements. So the board actually does collect reimbursements. Could be cost recovery, or it could be revenues from folks placed on probation. But we don't consider reimbursements revenues. Reimbursements, you will not see the word reimbursement on a fund conditions statement. So the reimbursements will be netted out of the total expenditures. So I just wanted to make that point. We're not going to see revenues. Next slide. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Karen Munoz.
Hi, how was everybody this afternoon? Today I'm actually going to go over the expenditures part. Thank you, Matt, for explaining the revenue and reimbursements. So we're going to go over, I'm trying to find my slide notes. I apologize. So for expenditures, what falls within the board's expenditures? We have licensing, the costs that are associated to processing these licensees. We deal with education. The board will deal with education and the costs associated with qualifications, or how we go about the qualifications of our licensees. Enforcement and enforcement related costs, those costs associated with compliance or other things. We've got Attorney General, OAH, witness fees associated with enforcement. And then the cost to maintain operations, administration costs. Those are costs you'll see within our general expense, other line items within your appropriation. And all of those also entail personal services. So everything that goes within your expenditures. We have a $6.5 million projected, but this is your expenditures and these are your appropriation. Next slide. Other non-board costs, pension payments. We've got statewide pro rata. These are impacts to the board's direct fund. So statewide pro rata. Next up. The next we'll go into step 3. These are your expenditures. Are we looking at discretionary versus non-discretionary? The questions we ask about what is more important when we are looking at a fund that, you know, we might need to make these decisions, these tough decisions on expenses. I'm looking at this is an example of what your expenditure report would look like. So this tells you what the board has been budgeted for. We've got a current month column of what's been expended year to date, and then your projected year end. This is just a example of what your fund would look like with expenses to date. Next slide. So talking about discretionary and non-discretionary expenses, we're looking at things that we would consider. So staffing level and composition. Are they sufficient enough to meet these goals? Policy and program goals. What are we doing? What is the board doing? Licensing timeframes. Are they being met? Same with enforcement. Are those being met? Are we meeting those goals? Operating costs. What is this cost that we are needing? So operating costs, are we looking at certain items that are required? Short-term versus long-term considerations. Where are we and where are we going? So are these, you know, we might be looking at short-term goals, limited term costs, or is this going to be an ongoing contractual or something like that? Next slide. So when we talk about responsibility, we divide it between what the board's responsibilities to their budget and then to the DCA. So when we look at board, we talk about their statutory requirements. We have regulatory responsibility. We have a fiduciary responsibility to meet and to stay within our appropriation. We have programmatic responsibilities and to our goals. Policy and mission. Those are all board responsibilities. DCA responsibility, centralized services. This is provide support and technical assistance. These are all provided through DCA-wide pro rata. So our centralized services, you'll see technical assistance from the executive office, the budget office, HR, and we'll provide that support as needed. Next slide. Okay, so that actually was everything that we had. So DCA, we work as a whole. So the boards, DCA, stakeholders, teamwork leads to success. So we're always there to help the boards, their stakeholders. We're there to assist you, you know, to make something successful. We need to work as a team. And if you guys have any questions, just let Matt or I know. We can definitely answer or provide some feedback.
Thank you so much, Ms. Munoz and Mr. Nishimini, for your presentation and this overview. Are there any questions or comments from committee members?
Hi, this is Ms. Nystrom. I don't have any questions. I just want to say thank you for the overview and for the information.
Thank you so much. Can we open it up for public comment, please?
This is the moderator. We have opened for public comment. If you would like to make a comment, please type the word comment into the Q&A box in the lower right-hand corner of your screen and send that comment to all participants. For dial-in users, please dial *3 to raise your hand, and we will call on people in the order that we have requests for comment. Let's take just a moment now to see if we have a request for public comment. Seeing no request for public comment, do you want to close comments at this time?
Sure, that will be fine. Thank you. Next up on the agenda, we will have a board budget update presented by board staff. I believe this is Mr. Glasspiegel, so I will pass it over to you whenever you're ready.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rogers. My name is Jason Glasspiegel. I'm the Central Services Manager for the Board of Psychology. And good afternoon, everyone. Included in the meeting materials is a board budget update. This is a history of the board's budget, a history of the ongoing structural imbalance, history of our fees, and just an example of how the board is unable to continue to fund itself with the current funding structure. The attachments is a fund condition statement prepared, which is, I believe, the same one that Mr. Nishimini showed, prepared on January 31st. And it shows the board becoming fiscally insolvent in fiscal year 2023-24, which starts July 1 of. I'm happy to answer any questions regarding this budget update.
Thank you, Mr. Glasspiegel. Any questions or comments from the committee?
None for me, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Nystrom. Mr. Moderator, can you open it up for public comment?
Absolutely. We are once again open for public comment. If you would like to make a comment, please type the word comment into the Q&A box in the lower right-hand corner of your screen and send that to all participants. If you are a dial-in user, please dial *3 to raise your hand, and we will call on people in the order that we have a request for comment. Let's take just a moment now to see if we have a request for public comment. Seeing no request for public comment, do you wish to close comments at this time?
Yes, please. Thank you. We will move to the next item on our agenda, which is the fee analysis and proposed fees presentation, which I believe will be led by Mr. Burke. I'll pass it over to you.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, Dr. Rogers, Ms. Nystrom. My name is Jonathan Burke. I'm the Assistant Executive Officer of the Board of Psychology, and I will be presenting the Fee Audit Analysis, sort of explaining our methodologies and the scope of that, and then going into what the actual results were with what staff believes the proposed fees should look like. Next slide, please. Okay, the Board of Psychology has a budget appropriation of approximately $7 million in this fiscal year. The fiscal year runs from July 1st and ends on June 30th of each year. The board has not increased its initial application or renewal fee since 1992, and as operating costs have increased, it has resulted in a structural imbalance. The board is currently facing a structural deficit, with expenditures outpacing revenue streams. The board does not receive funding from California's general fund, and its primary source of revenue are fees charged for each of the various license types. It's vital that the fees charged to licensees and applicants fully recover the costs that it takes to administer the program. Okay, and here you can see it's just a representation of how the board's expenditures, the expenses it costs to run the program, have been trending upwards. Our annual budgets increased with those, but our budget allocation rather. But you can see expenses are going up. Next slide, please. And here you can see our year-over-year revenue has stayed flat. There was a jump in fiscal year 2018-19 and 19-20. This was due to the repayment of a general fund loan, but you can see that our revenues have not been keeping paces with our expenditures, and therefore on the next slide, you can see here the trend that with each passing year, our fund condition is becoming more and more depleted, ultimately leading to currently insolvency in the year 2023, 2024. Next slide, please. Okay, so these are the fees as they exist right now, as they were established in 1992 or later, and as has been explained to you by Jason, the previous speaker, and myself in that little plotted history of the board's budget. These are not meeting our program expenditures. They are not covering the full cost that it takes to run the program. Now, regarding the fee analysis itself, the board's objectives for the analysis were to ensure that the board is fully accounting for all its costs, recovering adequate revenues to be reimbursed for its expenses, and building reserves to ensure future operations. The board's primary source of revenues are fees charged for each of the various licenses. The board does not receive funding from the general fund. Thus, the board is fully self-supported through its special fund, and it is vital that the fees charged to licensees and applicants fully cover the costs. The board staff have undertaken the task of analysing the fiscal health of the board, and we've worked with DCA budget experts to closely examine data, create formulas, and propose options for increasing fees imposed on licensees and registrants. The board did consider an independent fee analysis, but we ultimately decided that the high cost and lengthy time it would take to go out to a third party was not warranted, as the board can address the areas identified by the budget and business and professions committees and the fiscal committees of the legislature, and adequately demonstrate a need for a fee increase via this internal method. Next slide, please. Okay, so the scope of the fee analysis had the following objectives: to calculate the full cost of licenses and renewals, determine a fair and equitable method of allocating non-fee expenses such as enforcement to all licensees and registrations, and to develop revenue fee projections for 5 years to build in those fees. And last but certainly not least, the board is also committed, board staff, to review the performance of our core business processes themselves, to look for anywhere that costs can be improved upon and where efficiencies can be made. Slide. And here's a process of the analysis just to visualize it. Calculating the full cost of services, then you have identifying what our core business processes are, and then ultimately determining a pricing model. Next slide, please. So these were the various steps. The first step, collecting data, identifying those positions within each program that provide and support direct services. It also involved collecting program budget and expenditure data, identifying the salary and benefits for each position, and identifying non-personnel expenditures, as well as any program and board overhead. Specifically, we had to identify staff positions, calculate the number of productive hours, which is the number of actual hours spent on tasks, then identifying and allocating non-personnel and overhead costs. These include DCA pro rata, materials, office supplies, and so on, and then assigning any other expenses that are budgeted in other areas. And finally, identifying core business processes and activities. This step also involved discussions to understand at an operational level the work of the operating units. This includes processes that directly contribute to the processing of an application, with the most notable example being evaluation of a license application or renewal. Step 2, next slide, was building cost structures. And this second step involved the development of time estimates for processes and tasks in each program area. There are 3 components of this step, and this is you can see them here: gathering time estimates for direct processes. So we worked with board staff to estimate the time that was assigned for each process and the sum of all the process steps, the total time that is required to provide that specific service. Then we calculated the hourly rates and the cost of service, and this is calculated based on an hourly pay rate for individual staff members, and this was provided to us by DCA's budget office. And then gathering activity and volume data, which was critical component, and that's the number of times a given license or certificate is provided on an annual basis. Step 3, next slide, please. This third step allocates enforcement activities to arrive at the full cost of service for each license, registration, or renewal. Within DCA, enforcement is a significant portion of cost, and it has been increasing. Fourth step, next slide, is to establish a cost recovery. Now that's not cost recovery in the discipline enforcement sense of the word. It's recovering the costs to complete each business process within licensing, renewals, etc. And that's an example that needs to be made for each group of licensees, and it does depend somewhat on board policies. For instance, should psychological associates pay for the full amount of certain aspects, or could they be subsidized by other licensee types? A reason that that might be considered is that there is obviously a supervisory relationship between licensees and associates. There's also a board policy consideration that could be made of these are people at the beginning of their careers, they're entering the profession. So there's issues of access, potentially of equity as well that would be considered, but that's a policy step. And finally, the final step, step 5. Next slide, thank you. Is that fees should be set based on any cost recovery policy that's made and at a price that fully recovers the board's costs and provides a sustainable future that includes rebuilding reserves. We've worked closely to create those formulas and we've used accurate numbers when doing so. Direct and indirect allocated costs. So for this analysis, direct costs are defined as the direct time required to process a specific application type. This is driven by a calculation of a productive hourly rate for each staff position that includes salaries, benefits, and a prorated amount for services and supplies. After indirect costs are layered on top of the direct costs to establish the full cost of issuing a license. Next slide, please. Now, this is allocating the cost of enforcement. DCA, and this is a universal, has consistently seen enforcement costs increasing at a faster rate than general operating costs. There are 2 sources for these costs. External costs, which are assigned to the board. These include fees and payment of services for the Attorney General's Office, the Office of Administrative Hearings, evidence and witness fees, and investigations pro rata. And then you have the direct costs, which is expense from board staff themselves when they process complaints and initiate investigations. Next slide, please. Okay, board staff propose to include enforcement costs within the renewal fees, and this is a policy that you see consistently with other DCA boards and bureaus as well. I also want to comment that enforcement does also generate a small amount of revenue, as was shown during DCA's budget presentation, and this is done through cost recovery during discipline and the imposition of citations and fines. Now, the board does not collect all the fines that it assesses during discipline, and there are reasons for that. Firstly, we wouldn't necessarily all get it back at once. So in one fiscal year, say $20,000 might be imposed on a licensee who is put on 5 years probation. That licensee would have the 5 years to pay that off. So we'd receive that money in installments. Also, cost recovery itself, the amount that's ordered doesn't necessarily cover the full costs. That it's determined by the administrative law judge, by the board themselves. They can seek to reduce it. And of course, you can sometimes have negotiations with attorneys and things like that. So it's not always an accurate way of recovering the full enforcement cost. And finally, in cases where a licensee surrenders or has their license revoked, we don't really have a mechanism then to go after the money, supposing say $20,000 again, but we have the license. From a consumer protection standpoint, that person can no longer hurt California consumers. They're not a licensee of the board, and really we would only seek to get that money if they petition for reinstatement or reapplied. We would say, okay, well, yes, you can have your license, but you must pay what you owe from your previous discipline. So I just wanted to explain that a little bit in a little bit more detail. Next slide, please. Okay, and this is just a visualization of the difference between cost recovery ordered, cost recovery collected. Next slide, please. Okay, great. Well, thank you. That's me explaining the scope and methodology that we used. And now I'm going to hand it over to Jason Glassbeagle, the Central Services Manager, who will talk a little bit more about what that actually means for our fees once we've crunched all the numbers and applied all the formula that I've been speaking about. So, Jason.
Thank you very much, John. Good afternoon again, everyone. And as John said, we took a look at all of the costs to process applications within our program, and we looked at that in relation to all of the costs and came up with the document. We broke it up into two pieces: an application fees and then a renewal fees. And so this is the application one. You'll see renewals next. But the slide in front of you contains what the true cost is per application, and then what our current fee is for that same application. And then after that, I'm going to show you the renewal costs, which we have we've provided 4 different options, all of which achieve the same goal. But I'll explain that the top one is with inactive licensees and registrants, so registered psychological associates, paying 0% of the enforcement costs, but registered psychological associates paying 100% of the renewal responsibility, the remaining renewal responsibility. And then it goes down from 100% to 75% to 50% to 25%. And so those are the 4 options that were developed. The renewal fee with the 8% increase is the dollar amount that you should focus on if you're looking at which fees to look at. And I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank
Dr.
you.
Rogers, back to you. Sorry.
Yes. Thank you, Mr. Glassbeagle, and thank you, Mr. Burke, for that overview and all of your hard work. I actually had one question. Let me see if I can find where that was. In the discussion about the increasing enforcement costs, my question was, if the costs are increasing, how much notice does the board get that those fees will be increasing? Do you get any information ahead of time that that's coming?
Dr. Rogers, this is Jason Glassbeagle. I believe you were asking about enforcement costs and prior notice to any increase in costs related to enforcement.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Perfect. We do generally get notice ahead of time. I will defer to Mr. Burke, Ms. Rubio.
This is Antoinette. I'm trying to remember the last time there was an increase in attorney general costs, which were a significant increase. And I believe at that time we had a few months lead time, heads up on that. I don't believe we had a full year that to my memory. And I'm not sure if anyone from the DCA budget shop has a better memory than me on that, but I want to say we had a few months heads up, and then it was effective at the beginning of the fiscal year that change was put in place, and several programs were negatively impacted, and we are definitely not the only program looking at fee increases, but not solely because of Attorney General's costs, but that was a significant one.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Ms. Sorick. I really appreciate it.
No problem.
Any other questions or comments from the committee? Ms. Nystrom, I see your hand is up.
Hi, yes, this is Ms. Nystrom. Okay. Has there been effort to work with DCA to work with the Department of Justice to be, or the AG's office to be able to have a heads up when those fee increases are going to be made, so that way DCA boards can work, proactively to adjust instead of retroactively?
This is Antoinette. This one's a tough one. I think we're given as much lead time as is possible for those agencies, because sometimes those are salary driven. So it might be based on bargaining unit agreements and things of that nature, where there's a delay in knowing those costs are going to go up, and then it happens, and then we're kind of told at the back end, heads up, this is happening, and it's happening a few months from now. So yes, ideally it's always best to have lead time to know when things are coming down the pipeline, especially when it impacts our programs so much. But unfortunately, sometimes that doesn't always happen.
I think so.
Hey, this is Karen Munoz from the DCA Budget Office. I just wanted to jump in and Antoinette did mention the last time she wasn't sure about the last time the rates had increased. They actually increased in 2019, and Antoinette's correct that it was a significant increase within AG. And it was 2019. We got the notification right around July 1st, effective September 1st, across the board. So for reference, it was in 2019, September 1st, 2019.
Okay, I appreciate that. And Ms. Munoz, do you know of any effort that has been made or can be made to work with the AG's office to have a heads up, to be able to, like I said, proactively address, future fee increases?
I do know that we just always ask that we get as much a notice as possible. We are at the mercy of them, and when they can provide that information, I know they work on their end to generate these costs and the needs, and so we do definitely work with the Department of Justice. We just can't tell when they're going to give us. Just we ask for as much lead time as possible. It just doesn't always happen that way, but yes.
I can appreciate that. And then another question that I had was, I know that it's been about 30 years since application and renewal fees have been increased. And I was just curious for a little bit of the history as to how we've been able to maintain the fees where they've been at for so long.
So I think there's several factors that go into that. One is the cost of doing business continues to go up with the cost of labor, the cost of goods, the cost of services for the last 30 years. So those things can definitely be tracked over time. Another thing that has happened during my tenure with the board was that we would ask for positions without money because our bottom line was always good. So the recommendation historically had been just ask for the positions and say you're going to pay it out of your blanket, which is the money that's left over at the end of the year. it was a higher chance of success if you were asking for positions without dollars because we were managing our fund well. And in doing so, we were able to get the positions that we needed. For example, we got over each of the units, which their prior was just an AEO and myself. So we were able to get managers over the 3 units. We were able to get 3 analysts in the licensing unit, which helped with at that time, the 18-week backlog. And with the temp help that we were utilizing also out of the blanket, that was something that put us at like a 4 to 6 week turnaround time for licensing. We had to get rid of the temp help, and those costs also changed over time. So I don't know if that helps answer your question, but that's one factor that went into it, was asking for positions without any funding to go with it. So that depleted the bottom line over time.
Okay, I appreciate that. Thank you.
Sure.
And I have one last question going back to enforcement costs, and I'm not sure if this is a question for you, Ms. Sorick, or for Ms. Munoz or Mr. Nishimini. But if I understand correctly, the last increase for enforcement costs was back in 2019. Do we have a retrospective analysis of how often those fees do increase? Is that something that occurs yearly, every couple of years? Do you have any thoughts on that? What has the general trend been?
So in addition to the Attorney General fees, investigator pay also went up, and that would impact the Division of Investigation who conducts our investigations. I think that was a while in the making to bump that up, because I believe the department was trying to get in line with some of the other departments, because we were losing a lot of investigators to parallel investigator positions at other departments. So once that parity happened, it was great for our department. It was great for being able to stay on top of our cases, but that was also another increase. I believe that increase was effective 2020, but I will defer to Ms. Munoz on that. And then as far as the Attorney General rates, I believe it was back in 2015, the last time that attorney fees were increased. So it's definitely not on a yearly basis, but it had been a few years. Ms. Munoz, do you know a fact check on those 2 items by chance?
I actually don't have the answer for the investigator rate right off the top of my right at hand, but I can certainly look. I don't know, I wouldn't be able to provide you the actual time at this time, but I can get that information for you if you need it. And you are correct. I don't think the DOJ AG costs had increased. It's not an annual thing. It's more, timing. It hasn't been increased in a while since the 2019 one. We knew it was happening, or it was going to eventually happen, but it's not an annual thing.
Okay, all of that information is helpful. Thank you all so much. Any other questions or comments from the committee?
Dr. Rogers, I have one more
Sure,
question.
go ahead.
Sorry, Ms. Rourke, can we go back? So with on the staffing, so with the budget or with the fee increases that we're looking at now, my question is do you feel confident that you're fully staffed and that you're not in need of adding any additional staff on in any of the bases now?
This is to keep the lights on. Any kind of additional positions to improve our customer service levels, either in enforcement or in licensing, that's a separate conversation. This is just to keep the lights on.
Okay.
If that makes sense. I'm not trying to evade the question, but this is kind of step one before we would even kind of consider having that discussion as step two.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, I have no further questions or comments on my end. Can we now open it up, Mr. Moderator, for public comments or questions?
Absolutely. We are open for public comment. If you would like to make a comment, please type the word comment into the Q&A box in the lower right-hand corner of your screen and send that comment to all participants. If you are a dial-in user, please dial *3 to raise your hand, and we will call on people in the order that we have requests for comment. Let's take just a moment now to see if we have a request for public comment. Seeing no request for public comment, would you like to close comments at this time?
Yes, please. Thank you. In looking at the agenda, we just covered agenda item 6 for public comment on the proposed fee increase. And so that concludes our business for today. I'd like to thank everyone on the call today for their presence and their participation. And another deep bow of gratitude and a note of thanks to the board staff for all of their careful and thorough analysis and recommendations. It is now 1:47 p.m. and I declare this meeting of the Ad Hoc Budget Committee.
Dr.
Yes.
Rogers,
Yes,
sorry.
yes, yes.
I'm curious if we can put the fee options back up, and if we
Sure.
can kind of encourage some input and feedback on some of these numbers, and in particular, just from a staff perspective, I'm curious about the column that is listed renewal fee dollars/quantity. Mr. Glassbeagle, this is the column we're most interested in, correct? Getting feedback on?
The far right column, the renewal fee with 8% increase.
With the 8% increase. Okay, thank you. Again, just to reiterate with the different scenarios here, just a context, the staff had presented some scenarios to this budget committee, and the feedback was to try and see if there was a way to have some more renewal responsibility to not be solely to not be as weighted on the psychological associates. So I'm curious to get some feedback on these different options and get some discussion going on an equitable option from members of the public. And I know we have a few members in attendance, and so any kind of input or feedback on these different amounts for the committee to consider, because after this committee meets with stakeholders, there will be another committee meeting with Ms. Nystrom as well as Dr. Rogers with staff, and then that recommendation will come to the full board at the April board meeting. So I just wanted to add a little layer of context to encourage some discussion so that we can get some input for follow-up today. Apologies, Dr. Rogers.
No, not at all. Thank you so much for including that. I think that would be really, really helpful. So we have more input when we have our next committee meeting. Thank you.
Would you like the moderator to open it up for public comment?
Yes, that was my next comment. Mr. Moderator, can you please open it up for public comment if anyone would like to chime in?
Absolutely. We have once again to open for public comment. If you would like to make a comment, please type the word comment into the Q&A section and send that comment to all participants. If you are a dial-in user, please dial *3 to raise your hand, and we will display instructions momentarily. In the meantime, we have a request for comment from Jolinder Crow. Bear with us just one moment, please, and we will send you a request to unmute your microphone.
This is Dr. Jolinder Crow. I'm the CEO at the California Psychological Association. So thank you for inviting input. To be honest, it's a little bit hard to know what to offer. It's a little hard to understand, for example, this chart that you have there. There's a lot of language here that I don't think we really know what it means. We're not in the state budgeting process. So I'm just going to look at the numbers, but I don't, for example, understand the option 1, option 2, option 3, option 4, and what all of that means. I guess I would preface what I'm going to say by saying that I also run an organization, and we also have a budget, and we rely on member dues. And so I'm well aware of a budgeting process for a nonprofit association. There is just no way, I think, for us to know the inner workings of the Board of Psychology and the staffing. I have a lot of great respect for Antoinette and the work that you do. But I just don't know that, I'm not sure we can comment on your costs and so forth. I will just make a couple of general comments. Of course, no one is going to like a fee increase. No one ever does. It is regrettable probably that it's been so long since a fee increase, because I know from experience that sometimes it's easier to do incremental increases, and now this one is going to seem big. The consideration is, of course, that psychologists coming out of graduate school and getting licensed have a huge debt load, and it's getting bigger all the time. And I will say that I'm not sure I understand completely when you talk about the costs for enforcement. For example, if a licensee knows that part of their dues are going to pay for enforcement, and at a time when the disciplinary actions sometimes take so long and they're such a burden for the licensees, they're waiting sometimes for long periods of time before their case is resolved. So, you know, all of these things go into a scenario where no one is going to enjoy a fee increase. And I'm not sure what you mean by equitable. Maybe you could explain that a little bit. I'm not sure equitable to what? To other disciplines? I guess I'm stumbling a little bit because I don't think we know what we would say about a fee increase that you've already said that you must have in order to keep going. So I'm not trying to evade the question, but I just don't know, you know, in terms of how this gets played out. I mean, we've had opportunity for public comment at other committee meetings and at the board, and we haven't made any because this seems to be an operational issue that we just don't know very much about.
Thank you so much, Dr. Jolinder Crow. Would anyone from board staff like to comment?
This is Antoinette. I'm not sure if this will help respond, and I feel like I'm put in the position of what feels like cryptic answers today. But I think there are several different things that go into processing a complaint, doing a desk investigation. If it goes to formal discipline, we have expert fees, we have Office of Administrative Hearings fees, we have Attorney General's fees, investigator fees, and all of this continues to be just part of doing business. And what we try to do as best we can is to ensure that whatever is going to cost the board, that the person that did the wrong thing is paying for that. That's why we do cost recovery, because we don't think it's fair for licensees that are doing the right thing to pay for the ones that are doing the wrong thing. But the unfortunate reality is that we're getting 25% of the amount that we're charging to recover the costs of doing enforcement. And so, that is one factor that has gone into increased costs, and not being able to have our expenditures meet our revenues. So the main thing, and I know this, just kind of going back to this, is not so much a matter of eliciting or asking for comment on how we do our business or how we determine our process costs. But at the end of the day, what makes sense for people that have established careers, that are going to be paying renewal costs versus people that may be in a training category that are gaining hours towards licensure. You know, what we're looking for is to fill a gap to keep the lights on. We've determined the amount to fill that gap, and what we're trying to understand is who should pay what amount. What's a fair way to assign those costs to pay for conducting business. So I think as far as getting some input, and I appreciate any input that we can get today, but that's really what I'm looking at, is between options 1, 2, 3, and 4, what makes the most sense. And as staff, we don't have an idea for that because we're just trying to, fill that gap to keep our lights on. So we just want to make sure that these dollar amounts align with what makes sense practically with someone, like I said, who has an established career, an early career psychologist, or a trainee that's a registered psychological associate. What can they afford? What makes sense? And what's fair? Dr. Linda Crow, does that make more sense?
A little bit. I wish I could do better. I wish I knew more about how these numbers stack up. So when you're talking about the psychological associate, so is the 773, would that be for a license? That would be for a licensee, right?
Right. So the biennial renewal PSY, that's a psychologist. The
Okay.
inactive renewal for a psychologist, and then annual renewal, the PSB is a registered psychological associate.
Okay.
So as you can see in option 1, you have it at 773 for the psychologist, 448 for the psychological associate.
Right.
That number continues to go down with the amount of renewal responsibility for the psych associate. So in the last option, you see that the psychologist has 807, and then the registered psychological associate would have a renewal of 112.
Oh, I see what you mean. Yeah, well, it's just a difficult question. Like I said, it's a big fee increase, and I don't know about the question of who can afford what. I mean, I think I understand the logic that you might be using, and that is that a person that's more established might be able to bear a kind of a heavier burden for a licensing fee than a person just getting started. So now I see what you mean, that in the second option, a psychological associate would only pay $336 instead of $448, and so on, right? So I do see that. I think, if we're honest, and I think we can be here, it's also just a difficult time right now because, frankly, the processing times are longer, and it is harder to get a response from the board. I wish it were coming at a time when, the processing times were really short, and people, when people call the board, they could get an answer to their question. I don't, but I'm not, I'm not quibbling with your, I completely understand and believe that what you were saying about needing a fee increase in order to cover your operational costs. Like I said, I mean, I'm in the same business, and it's just the way it goes sometimes. I think the difficulty is trying to figure out that balance, and I see that you are trying to figure out that balance. I'm just not sure, to be honest, that we have a lot of insight. I don't want to be the one to say that an established psychologist could afford $784 more than $773, maybe. Yes, it's true that psychological associates, if they're brand new and they are getting hours, yes, it's hard. If they fall into the category of someone who's been a psychological associate for a long time, then maybe they're more established than you might think. So I think we're both in the position today, Ms. Sorick, of giving cryptic answers, because I just don't know which one to pick. Option one, option two, I don't know. I think as you get up to close to $800 for a license fee, that's starting to sound pretty steep. So I guess what we would say is that we would hope that the fee increase could be as nominal as possible and still get you where you want to go. But that's about the best I can do. I think, I know Dr. Winkleman is here. Our Director of Government Affairs is here. I don't think there's anything that any of us can shed much light on other than what I've said.
Thank you.
This is the moderator. We've had a couple of people join us in the middle of the conversation. If you would like to make a comment, we are open for public comment on this. Please type the word comment into the Q&A section in the lower right-hand corner of your screen and send that comment to all participants. If you are a dial-in user, please dial *3 to raise your hand, and we will call on people in the order that requests for comment are made. Jason, if you want to bring us back to the other slide, give people a chance to see what they might be commenting on. We're going to hold this open for a little bit longer. Seeing no additional requests for comment, do you wish to proceed?
Yes, please. Thank you. Okay. It is now 2:05 p.m. and we have reached the last item on our agenda, which is to adjourn the meeting. So I would like to declare this meeting adjourned. Thank you all so much for your time and attention and participation and offering your insights and reflections. And we'll take this back and we'll have our next committee meeting where we will take some of this input into consideration and we will move forward. Thank you all so much for your time and attention today.
Thank you.
Thank you.